So now I'm going to introduce the next speaker. I encourage Jonas and George to come onto the stage. So our next two speakers, as I just said, are Jonas Mago, who is a PhD student in Neurosciences at McGill University, and George Deane, which is a PhD student in the School of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. So without further ado, I'll let them start their talk.
Yeah, thank you for those great talks up to this point, and thank you for having us at this conference, both George and me. George, in fact, just finished his PhD, so congrats on that, George. It's been a while now. And let's dive right into our talk. So before we start, maybe worth saying that this is work with a bit of a bigger team. Lars Sandwitz-Smith, Christopher Timmerman, Robin Card-Harris, Maxwell Ramstead, and Michael Lifshitz are all on the team and have all inspired this work with us. So shout out to all of them. All right, so in our talk, we will talk a bit about the phenomenology of self and agency and think about how active inference can allow us to model these things. Though we will push it a bit into the spiritual domain of things. So, so far we've talked a lot about self and agency and active inference model for like kind of individuals and social dynamics. But under in certain kind of spiritual or paranormal states, people report things of feeling somewhat of connection to the universe or the world, or more interestingly, feel the presence of something like a god who's speaking through people, or the presence of elves or other entities or spirits. And most particularly, this phenomena are prevalent when people take rather high doses of psychedelic substances, but also under meditation and other kind of collective rituals, in charismatic Christian prayer, these things are also prevalent. And so what we try to do is to take the active inference framework to get a bit of a grip of how these phenomenologies can come about, and to kind of be able to give a bit more of a kind of theoretical footing. We will focus on psychedelics as the cause of these experiences in particular. All right, just to give it a bit of a sense what we talk about when we say that there are these entity encounters. These things are strikingly human-like and have all the qualities that humans have. So when people report this data is, I think, people reporting entity encounters induced by DMT. These entities that are encountered are often conscious, intelligent, benevolent, and sacred. Furthermore, the qualities by which these entities are encountered, that's by kind of vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell. So all these things that are kind of common for human interaction, but there's also an extra sense, the extrasensory kind of level by which we interact with these agents. And the last thing is these encounters are incredibly meaningful, and some have argued that a big therapeutic effect lays in the phenomenology of the psychedelic experiences, including these entity encounters. So therefore we deem it valuable to understand what is happening in these moments. We've given this talk before, and this is an ongoing project. And the novel thing for the talk today is that we have a rich computational framework to express our thoughts. And the way how we kind of go through this talk is that we have these entity encounters that we want to explain. And we kind of build it up from the bottom. So we start talking about allostatic control and kind of some minimal self. So how do we usually model and monitor our own physiological kind of a system, to then think about how do we model kind of interpersonal dynamics. And that's the Frith and Friston paper. It's been mentioned in many talks so far, kind of building up from personal self to kind of interpersonal selfhood, up to the REBUS model. And the REBUS model basically outlines a breakdown of this hierarchical structure. And once we have the REBUS model established, we will look into a computational model to think about if the computational structure fails in certain dynamics, what will be the implications for the larger system at whole? And our goal is then to say that that can wrap up and kind of link back to these entity experiences. We assume quite a lot of background knowledge for this because we don't have time to go through all the modeling. But here's a very quick summary based on a paper by Lars Sandberg-Smith and now talking about metacognition. And this is basically a summary of much of the progress that this community has done on active inference, and especially concrete time and discrete time-space modeling. First, there's the idea that systems use some form of inference to understand the world. Then we kind of build it up and say that this inference process can be guided by a precision parameter. And then we build it up once more to say this inference is embedded in an action framework where kind of the agent can act to change its own and the world states from moment to moment to moment. And at that stage, kind of we have this first active inference, because like active as like comes from the action part in this model. So this is kind of the basics of the model that allows us to kind of interact with the world while still doing inference. There's a whole lot to understand in these diagrams, and I'm quite sad that we don't have the time to go into those, but I can highly recommend the Sandberg-Smith et al. Paper to kind of get an introduction to these things. Where we start is we start on this last panel, on this very panel, which is basically the hidden states or the multimodal percepts, which is about what am I perceiving? And that includes different levels of perception, the interoceptive, the proprioceptive, and the exteroceptive sense. And then we have the actions which are across time with pi here, which is the question, what shall I do given these percepts across time? And now the cool thing that Maxwell has done a lot of work on is that these things can be nested in one another. So we can just put another level on top that basically monitors the performance on this lower level. So while we have these multimodal percepts on a very rudimentary level, we can have a next higher level, which is some form of minimal self, some form of tracking of what kind of sensory percepts are going on, and how well am I as a system doing in kind of monitoring these different sense parameters. And that's what we then call the deep generative model of mental action or hidden mental states. And that's where Lars has done a lot of work to say, this can answer the question of what am I paying attention to? What am I trying to pay attention to? And then just as on the lower level, on this higher level, that can kind of unfold over time. So that basically means that I'm able to kind of monitor my performance on the sense level across time. And so why this is pretty interesting is that this gives us like a first complete model of a system to control itself. And that basically is what in the cognitive sciences is often referred to as allostatic control. And because this is the foundation of what our more complex model will build on, we'll spend the next few slides on diving in depth into allostasis, really. And over to you, George.
Great, yeah, thank you, Jonas. So I'm going to kind of give a kind of conceptual overview or way of thinking about how to understand the pre-reflective or minimal sense of self. And I describe it as a allostatic control model. Allostasis being defined as, there's lots of work by Peter Sterling on this concept, but basically predictive regulation. So rather than homeostasis being confined to closed loop control in the present, allostasis is anticipating dyshomeostatic outcomes and acting to avoid them before they arise. So yeah, we can think about active inference as a formalization of this idea. So with action being a process of inference and organisms inferring actions which are have the least expected free energy or the most self-evidencing. So basically those actions which are conducive to remaining in a species-specific window of viability or phenotype congruent state. So given the kind of organism you are, you have kind of phylogenetically endowed expectations of the kind of states you should be in. Yes, expected free energy can be decomposed into epistemic and pragmatic value. So this is the idea of learning about the environment while realizing prior preferences, which could be either genetically endowed or could be ontogenetically endowed, or like Natalie's talk earlier, could start thinking about like how does culture shape prior preferences. So yeah, the kind of starting point here is that there's the notion of self is implicit in the active inference framework. In one sense, because action itself involves systematic misrepresentation, so representing being in another state than to what you're currently in. So attenuating, so you can think of physiological attenuation. So you're attenuating evidence that my arm isn't moving in order to bring about a desired movement where the higher precision is afforded to the expected consequences of the action. So to kind of unpack this a little bit conceptually, Jonas, could you flick the slide? So this allostatic control model, so this is kind of, it draws upon lots of different areas of literature and kind of past accounts, but on the one hand, you've got this notion of control, or the system inferring itself as an endogenous cause. So that's the story that Jakob Hoey and John Michael have told. This is why anybody should have a self. And then also these stories about sense of agency, the sort of correspondence of the expected consequences of actions and the actual consequences, the actual outcomes, that being associated with a sense of agency. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then on the other side, these grounding sense of self in the body. So this stuff Anil Seth's done a lot on, and other people, Lisa Feldman Barrett perhaps, relating self-modeling or the sense of self to interoception. So the central claim here about my central claim here is that the sense of self originates from inference about endogenous control of self-evidencing outcomes, where self-evidencing can be understood in terms of staying within a species-specific window of viability. Can you go on? So just to kind of unpack this notion of control. So this is an example taken from Hoey and Michael, but if you imagine a very simple creature, probably much more simple than this sea slug. So this creature notices that the world periodically goes black, and it doesn't know why. And it's kind of, really basic question is like, is this due to exogenous causes? Is this something in the world, or am I causing this? And the idea is that once it notices the correspondence between, the world goes black periodically when, this certain motor command occurs, then the system starts to then, so this motor command is correlated with the world going black. It's probably due to an endogenous rather than exogenous cause. And so it's attributed to self rather than other. So it's this kind of really basic, basic distinction of self being related to endogenous causes and other being related to exogenous causes. And the predictability of the sensory consequences of actions being the key thing there. Do you want to, can you flick, Jens? So one way of illustrating this, imagining being in wearing a virtual reality headset. If if your virtual hands, if the movement of your virtual hands corresponds to the actual movements that your arms are doing, you'll have a feeling of agency and authorship over the outcomes of the action, over what you're seeing. But if they're behaving randomly or they don't correspond, it doesn't feel like you, and it lacks this feeling of agency and authorship. So there's this idea here that the system is constantly tracking its control of sensations, and this dates back to the literature on corollary discharges and efference copies, and thinking about refining motor commands. yeah, and so we're already to start thinking about how this is related to sensory attenuation. So the physiological sensory attenuation being attenuating where my arm currently is in favor of where I'm expecting it to be, and also perceptual sensory attenuation. So cancelling out the self-generated consequences of actions. And yeah, as we'll see, failure of sensory attenuation underlies quite a lot of the phenomena we're going to talk about. Yeah. So yeah, this is where it connects to the body. So the idea is that the system's not kind of dispassionately just inferring, you know, how can I control sensation via action, but it's really, you know, there are particular things it needs to control, and that is kind of most fundamentally, perhaps keeping essential variables or states of the body within certain bounds. So perhaps like staying a certain body temperature, because these are the things which are most fundamental to continued existence and survival. So they're the things that, in terms of prior preferences, they're going to be further genetically endowed, high precision on prior preferences for certain interoceptive states. We can also think about, you know, so how this extends over time. So with a deeper temporal model with, you know, increasingly abstract outcomes on longer time scales. Yeah, the richer and deeper the model, the more the system's going to have prior preferences subtending longer time scales. And we could also think about how those are acquired over ontogeny, or, you know, something like social status, or things like that, more abstract things going further away from the kind of states of the body, but are also important for, yeah, continued existence. So yeah, so the essential idea there is that the this inference about allostatic control, so this permeates like the perception of the world, such that things appear salient according to, you know, your inference about allostatic control. And this also relates to, so if you're hungry, you know, food appears salient, but it can be also controlling prior preferences on longer timescales. But this also relates to tracking, tracking prediction error reduction over longer timescales. So thinking about affect and yeah, kind of realizing prior preferences on those longer timescales. The system also wants to keep track of that. So think of like kind of most invariant aspects of the self model. Yeah, do you want to move on, Jonas? So this is the story about inferring states of oneself, but at the moment we don't have any kind of story about inferring states of other people. So at the moment we've just talked about the minimal self, and you might imagine that, you know, quite simple creatures have this kind of minimal self model, but they lack representing the self as a self, and they lack in representing other agents as other agents. So the idea here is that, you know, while an allostatic control model allows the system to infer states of itself, you can also use this self model in order to, you know, the goal here being to better predict the sensorium on various timescales. You can use this same self model to predict the behavior of others. So you can think about, so kind of the essential story here is, what state would I be in order to perform that behavior? So if you see someone going to the fridge, what state would I be in to perform that behavior? And then you infer that their state is, you know, perhaps they're hungry, but then you can think about more complex things, or perhaps something like facial expressions being quite an interesting example. So in inferring someone else's affective state, one way of doing that is to simulate their facial expression. So yeah, if you want to do the slide, Jonas. So yeah, this goes back to like, yeah, simulation theory, connects to early literature. But the idea is using your own self model, but kind of via mental action, bending it into states of the agent you're observing. So if you're seeing someone putting a disgusted facial expression, micro muscle movements to mimic that facial expression to then infer what state would I have to be in order to display this behavior. The idea being you'd have to be in, and then on that basis infer, oh, okay, this other agent is experiencing disgust. So this connects to what we heard a little bit about earlier. So this duet for one idea, so using your own generative model and either attenuating your kind of self model when attending to others, so another speaker, for instance, and then or attenuating the sensory evidence in order to speak. So then focusing back on the self, so flipping between modeling yourself and others by kind of changing the precision on the self model. So this is like what the allostatic control or minimal self model idea. Jonas will talk about the this in terms of a computational model in a second, and then getting this extra kind of metacognitive layer, which is attributing, is this self or other? Do you want to do this slide, Jonas? I'll hand over to Jonas now. Talk more about it.
I need to unmute myself. All right, thank you, George. So what I will try to do now in the last bit of this presentation, I will talk all the rich work that George has just presented, and in fact, George has been working on for many years by now, and try to put it in this in a computation language. And I'll pick up again where I left off last time. So I introduced this basic kind of generative model of this active inference scheme, and then we said that we can embed this in the next higher level that represents this minimal self and that extends over time. And now the last point that George made is to say, if we model other agents using the same generative model, we need a higher level that is able to distinguish what of those states that we infer belong to ourselves, which of those belong to other agents that we interact with. And that's why you have to kind of zoom out once more and add another layer on top. And that's the reflective self. And also this is very close to the work by Lars Sandwich-Smith and Al, where he calls this level the metacognitive level, or the kind of reflective level. And in this hidden meta-awareness state, we contextualize or disambiguate mental states. So we can say whether the mental states we infer here, whether they belong to self or other. And as a consequence of that, that allows us to do a representation or reflection of the self. Because if we say that here self-inferential processes happen, then this level cannot yet allow us to make reflections about these inferences. And that's why we need the next higher level in order to be able to model them. And as argued before, the whole idea is that the same thing expands over time, just like any level does. And that we need such a level has already been argued for in this Lars Sandwich-Smith work. But what we are now doing in our talk here is to kind of use that model and think about how would that change in the case of the psychedelic experiences, and what would be the consequences. Here, this attention and attenuation, which is the top layer, regulate how the deep temporal model are updated by the multimodal percepts. So basically this inference process. And one thing that I want to focus on in particular is this parameter here, the precision parameter, because that's where most of our kind of forthcoming work lies. And this precision parameter, the precision parameter determines how much an agent updates his beliefs based on some observation. And the idea is that optimal precision control requires a mixture of volatility and rigidity. And down here, this is just an image, and you've all seen this, right? Like, I guess everyone here is somewhat of an expert in Bayesian brain hypothesis, Bayesian modeling. that we have a prior and a posterior, and then we make an inference which lays somewhere in between, and how far we are close to the prior or the posterior depends upon the precision of those two. And this has been kind of explained in great detail in terms of mathematical expressions. I won't go into that too much. There's great literature on this already. But the point to get home here is to say, if we have this inference from some observation to some hidden state, this is guided through a mapping A, and the mapping is influenced by this precision parameter. So the core is this precision parameter determines how our states S are changed depending on some observations, O. And now we can think about the breakdown of this model. And therefore I refer to REBUS. And REBUS is something that became quite popular in the past few years. So chances are that most of you have heard of it before. It's a collaborative work between Robin Card-Harris and Carl Friston. And it's the first big paper on using active inference to describe the psychedelic state. And the analogy that is used is one of metal. And the idea is that if people take psychedelic substances, this is for the case of LSD acid, I think. If people take high doses of psychedelics, then their brain becomes a bit more flexible, just like metal, the annealing of metal. In that state, you can kind of bend the brain in new shapes and then kind of hardens again. Just like with cognitive mechanisms, the highest layer kind of weakens a little bit, and that allows the whole structure to be a bit more malleable. And if you look at these two diagrams in the brain, the idea is that this is the topmost layer, and this is kind of the sense input. And usually we have strong priors that determine perception. So we have strong priors, they're strongest on the topmost layer, and they kind of determine perception all the way through. And if these priors are kind of have reduced precision, the effect isn't that strong. So there's less constraint for perception based on these priors, and the sensory inputs have a stronger effect on the overall updating of the perceptual system. And the effects or the consequences that this reduction of precision in the brain is incredibly wide. And especially George, throughout his PhD, has published on various of such things, on kind of the ego dissolution state, the dissolving the self, and depersonalization, and basically states where we consider the self or the agentic experience as the highest inference that we make about sensations in our body. But if these topmost layers, if they kind of are reduced in precision, and there's a neurophysiological story about this, of how the 5-HT2 receptors are kind of blocked. If that's kind of, if we introduce some noise, then this inference process doesn't work. And these are just some examples of publications showing the phenomenological consequences that this has. And now, and this is probably the most important slide of this presentation. So if after almost half an hour you got a bit kind of drowsy, this is the moment to kind of watch out and kind of get the gist of this presentation. So this again, and I just say it again, this is the graph that's already incredibly widely used in the active inference kind of community. And now the idea is what REBUS says. REBUS says there's the function of higher order cognition is disrupted. And the result, reduced accuracy in deployment of precision estimates. So if this highest level, if that doesn't function accurately, then its role cannot be executed properly. And its role is to deploy precision on the next lower level. And the reason why the precision deployment is important is that is the mechanism by which the higher level can kind of constrain the inference process on the next lower level. So this is one technical way of how priors can constrain perception. So if we say that the precision control doesn't work well on this level, then the accuracy of the functioning of this level will, of course, also break down. And that means that reduced precision deployment on the mid layer has downstream effects, meaning that the precision estimates on this next lower level also fails. And if precision guidance is inaccurate on this next lower level, that means that we don't constrain the interpretation of sensory data as we usually do, or in the way how we usually train to, but that now the observation that we have may have a much stronger effect in updating, because we're not sticking so much to our priors at this moment. And now we kind of go upstream and think about the effects that this has. So lower precision on this lowest level leads to a failure in sensory attenuation. Otherwise attenuated sensations are now attended. That means we are now that sense data that we usually ignore has now a strong effect in updating our priors. The now attended observations lead to a rapid updating of posteriors on all levels. And where that is the case is if they update our hidden states more strongly, then that kind of moves up all the way. Interoceptive, proprioceptive, and exteroceptive sensations are less stable and more volatile. They change more quickly because they are less constrained by priors. The next higher level, mental states that are inferred based on these volatile sensations are A, also more volatile, and B, less accurate in inferring mental states of self and other. And that implies that that this may infer agentic qualities in inanimate things and alterations in representing agents. So in the story that we told before, this mid-level layer is the level where the first few kind of hidden mental states and models are built. And if now the data we get is inaccurate, we're not able to build any accurate models, and may that be models of ourselves. That's why the perception of kind of bodily sensations may change. The people experience maybe have an experience where they don't feel certain body parts, or feel they kind of lift into the air, or the body expands or contracts. But the same applies when we look out into the world and how worldly objects, how they are different. And then on the next level, because the inferred mental states are surprising and unexpected, the attribution or contextualization mechanism fails to accurately infer boundaries or distinctions between self and other. And this point is very similar to the conversation we had in the break, in the lunch break, where we said that on the most highest level, we have models of the world that are finely attuned and finely interplaying with a certain milieu of kind of a brain structure of information that we expect to receive. And if we introduce noise in this entire system, then the data that this highest level model has to interpret or has as an input just doesn't make sense to that model, and that makes it just hard to accurately kind of then infer states of self or other or entity or not. And so with this hierarchical structure, the idea is that in this middle layer, we infer agentic qualities, that being agentic qualities of ourselves or other people, like the dread for one. And this next higher level is where we then distinguish whether these agentic qualities belong to self or to other. And the idea is that then that allows us to kind of quantify a bunch of different experiences, depending on which of these, whether it's the mid layer, the agentic, non-agentic layer, or the highest level that distinguishes endogenous and exogenous causes. So depending on where we introduce noise into the system, different phenomenologies may emerge. So that is the model as it stands so far, and this may have a bunch of implications that can be kind of further explored that we just want to hint at, which is the cultural context that psychedelics are experienced very differently depending on where they are taken and the kind of the cultural and social environment. And there is something to be explored about the valence and the insightful character of entity encounters, that people often experience these moments as almost enlightening experiences. There's something about how entity experiences induced by different psychedelics compare. They're most prominent under DMT, but they're also common on other psychedelics, and they have different neuropharmacological kind of mechanisms, so it's worth exploring those. Then it's interesting to compare these models that we have with entity encounters that are experienced in a religious context, that from the description sometimes are very similar to what's experienced under DMT and other psychedelics. There's a bit more comparative work to be done in comparing these entity encounters with other altered self-experiences, like the work I hinted at that George has published. There's something about entity encounters and their link to well-being, and in particular this idea that I hinted at the beginning, that it's the phenomenology of these psychedelic experiences that may have of course the therapeutic context, the therapeutic results. And finally, a bit of like a kind of metaphysical question of entity encounters. Are they altered or normal states? Are they hallucinations or more true perceptions? And all these points are cool points to discuss further. If you have thoughts on them, feel free to reach out. And that is our little circle, hopefully making it back to give some intuition for entity encounters. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, George. That was a wonderful talk. Does anyone have any questions? You can move now to the Q&A podium.
And if there's no question, then we could also just elaborate on these discussion points a little bit. Maybe George has something to add.
Well, I have a quick question if nobody else does. So how are you thinking of, setting up because I heard you and Michael are going to be doing EEG stuff pretty soon. So I was thinking, what's your experimental setup? Are these things related? And how, if what you were telling me about isn't related to this, how would you, design an interesting task that might elucidate, the entity experiences?
One of the things that I'm currently looking into, it's not too much, I guess it's a bit of an experiment, is that we work with, that we have this ketamine trial, but that we also have some work with this charismatic Christian prayers that have an experience where they kind of are taken up by the Holy Spirit and kind of are moved by the Holy Spirit. And the idea is to basically do some correlations of their kind of phenomenology or their experience of such kind of encounters and in states of entropy in the brain, with the idea that kind of measures of entropy allow us to tease apart a little bit where this hierarchical structure might be disrupted. And for that, I think the interesting part would be to look into different measures of entropy. There's, like I mentioned it in the break, there's a bunch of different mathematical definitions of entropy. There's various local and global measures of it. So I think the interesting first step would be to check how can we find brain measures that are associated to a breakdown in this hierarchical structure. And then the next step is using that and correlating that with phenomenology.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Maxwell. And thanks for your input on this work so far. It's been greatly appreciated.
Well, it's been my pleasure. This is really exciting work to be working on.
I think Marco has a question, otherwise I'll go. Go ahead, Marco.
Hi, I'm a bit on my last legs of my brain. So that was interesting. I was just a small question. Could you just go back to the slide where you had the nice phenomenological space thing? Yeah, that was great. I'm wondering if ego inflation is actually should be the focus, because at least anecdotally, sharing this discussion. So I find it interesting that when it comes to the agentic, endogenous agentic part, the more fascinating thing is the exploration of the self in different lenses. And I think I wouldn't say it's inflation, but it is more focus in a particular lens of self. And I think that is simply the analog of the variability of sensory signals, right? So the variation of the self model, I would guess, that is simply more decorated by whatever state one might be in. And I think that is nothing else than, I guess I should also share some other assumption. I would say that synesthesia, which is also, of course, facilitated in these experiences, it's just one particular example of this cross-chat that you see in neuroimaging. And so maybe these egoic hallucinations or experiences are also a kind of cross-chat, cross-contamination between the self-model and other models. And I think that might be an interesting lens to also explain the variances. So you see in the chats, like some people see Christian characters. Even though I grew up in Holland, went to Christian schools, I saw Buddhist characters. And so the cultural, how do you say this? Not tainting, but yeah, the cultural coloring of the entities, I think is fascinating. And I think it would be a small step to incorporate this in the model. I'm not sure what you think of that, but sorry, my brain is dying. So whatever thoughts you have.
George, if you have something, otherwise I would say a word about the cultural kind of considerations.
Maybe just the first point, or thinking about maybe this isn't your point exactly, but I guess within this framework, you could start thinking about conceptualizing experience and psychedelic experience of experiencing God. So kind of phenomenologically, it seems, people report under psychedelics, there's kind of less and less causes. So I understand the kind of sensory blending to be this kind of story. So the music and the plants are moving in time together because there's some underlying common cause causing all these sensations. And the more the kind of pattern matching machine kind of widens its aperture, the more is swallowed up by that. So once everything is under a common cause and it's all agentic, then you've got something that is like an experience of God. Or if everything's under a common cause and it's like agentic and it's endogenous, then you've got kind of self is God or ego expansion kind of story.
Just to clarify, I'm talking about the other side of the graph, the endogenous agentic part, right? So I agree, if everything's on the same cause, I think that's a nice explanation for experiencing God or the complete wholeness or the oneness of the universe. But I think I think in terms of, I guess, system neuroscience or inference, it's maybe more interesting to explore the colorful diversity that occurs in the more endogenous and agentic parts. Because I think that's also something that's underappreciated and in often description of phenomenology, and maybe more practically relevant or significant when talking about the therapeutic effects. Because it seems to me that the effects of the self model might have interesting relations to the therapeutic effects.
There's one more point.
Yes. Sorry, maybe Jonas will say more about this in a second, but just, I guess, I guess then you start thinking about people have these extraordinary experiences and they will bring whatever conceptual frameworks they have in order to understand them. So, DMT in different cultures can be Santo Daime in Brazil, it's within a Christian framework, or if it's shamanic context, it can be very different, or these entities are part of nature. So I would think that's kind of just bringing, and that can also be after the fact, or it can permeate experience itself, but it can also be after the fact, trying to explain what must have happened there. I must have encountered angels or something like that. Anyway, sorry, Jonas.
One thing just to add, because it has been quite confusing for me for a long time, and I keep it 10 seconds now, is that what we say is that precision on the priors is reduced. And that is kind of countering this idea that there's cultural inference, because priors are where kind of cultural pattern beliefs are stored. But the important thing to take is, because the sensory information that's upcoming is so unknown, is that because we have nothing to really rely on, we have to rely on the best thing we have. And in that case, even kind of priors that are kind of very imprecise might still be more precise and have a stronger influence than the even less precise sensory input that's incoming.
I think it's very important to distinguish the variation as something that is completely unrecognizable and something that's simply surprising the variation within a certain state space or dimension. And I think that these kind of nuances are important to make a difference for. And I think the second question, and it should not be too long, but the second thing that I want to point out is not everyone and not everything in the models would be equally sensitive to the injected noise from psychedelic substances. And I think that is also an important question, like what is differentially sensitive to the particular noise that's being injected into the system? But I see Mo already kind of...
Yes, I'm so
yeah,
sorry.
okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to give Professor Marta Garrido her spot now, as she is one of the keynote speakers of our conference. So thank you so much, Jonas and George. This was an amazing talk and very stimulating. If you want to continue the discussion again, the chat is available, and you can continue after the presentation outside the conference room.